You're listening to Shoe In, covering the ins and outs of all things footwear, from sneakers to heels, loafers to slippers, and every type of shoe in between. Brought to you by the FDRA, the Footwear Industries Association focused on retail, trade, politics, and fashion, helping create and enhance conversations on all things footwear.
Hello, Shoe and Show listeners. We are so excited that you're back for another edition of the world's greatest shoe industry business podcast. Bar none, it is the greatest. Spread the word. We've been doing this almost 7 years. Thomas Crockett, who is my partner in crime today. And it's just hard to believe when you look back, all the conversations that we've had on all the different topics. The intro speaks very well of kind of what we talk about. But one of the things we focus on pretty consistently, because it's so chaotic but also so critical to our business, is the supply chain. And so when you think about the movement of goods, you think about bringing in 2.5 billion pairs of shoes every year. I mean, we're pushing almost 8 pairs of shoes for every single person in the US. You're going to need partners in crime on the supply chain side to help warehouse those products, deliver those products, move the products around, inventory the product, whatever your need is, you're going to need people to help you do that, Thomas. And so I'm really excited about today's conversations because it's going to focus us in on what's happening in 2023 and some of the key kind of critical scenarios that are laying out on supply chain. If you remember, in January, we had an episode with Crocs, with Mary McNally at Crocs, and we talked about supply chain from her perspective. And so now we're going to bring in an expert to help guide us through the current lay of the land as it relates to supply chain and warehousing. And so who do we have on the program this morning?
Yeah, so we're really excited to bring in Steven Crerar from Farrow Logistics to talk with us about these issues. And you mentioned, supply chains. And for folks that aren't logistics people that are listening, this has become a hot topic for everybody. I mean, if you watch the State of the Union this year, the president was talking about supply chains. If you watch the China primetime hearing, supply chains kept coming up. This was front page news stories not too long ago. So I think the American public, anybody listening to this, is interested in supply chains potentially. So we wanted to bring in Steven. We're so glad to have you, and thanks so much for being on the show with us today.
Thank you. Pleased to be here. Appreciate the opportunity.
So, Steven, let's start out the gate. Let's set the groundwork. What's your role at Farrow, and kind of on a day-to-day basis, what are you focused on?
I focus mostly on filling buildings. And frankly, it was an interesting introduction how high profile now supply chain has become. In a perfect world, which would have been pre-pandemic, you wouldn't hear about us. We're the quiet guys behind the scenes that never really ought to be talked about, but we've become front and center, and that's not necessarily a comfortable position for most supply chains because by definition, they don't have a ton of flexibility to them. They're not called supply bungees. They're called chains, and they have limitations towards what they can do when they have the right information. So my role in Farrow is to fill the buildings that we have with relevant business that helps us to both grow our bottom line and our customers, not necessarily in that order, but we do focus on certain organizations that are in need of sophisticated supply chain solutions, a little bit more flexibility, and that kind of ideal one-stop shop that Farrow can provide, because we do it from origin station right through to final mile front door of your customer's house. So my job is to find those customers and bring them into the organization, and then nurture them and help them grow.
I think some of the headlines and focus has been on supply chain disruptions and things that companies have to face during incredibly difficult times that we've seen in the past. Just wondering, from your perspective, are there some disruptions, some kind of key things to watch for as a company that maybe they're on the horizon, or just kind of a general problem you might face?
Sure. Yeah, and what a buzzword that's become, disruptions. Again, the evolution of our vernacular is exposing supply chain in areas that it had never been exposed before. We are focused right now where we used to be really lean, and that whole idea of just in time, you needed a very lean supply chain. It was extremely competent if only you had to deal with the minor little disruptions through the year, the Chinese New Year and occasional labor disruptions, or maybe there were congestion at port or equipment issues. Now the disruptions are scaled up. Now they're literally at countries. Countries are shut down. Ports are shut down. You're dealing with e-com. It's a massive disruption as well. What we need to do in our supply chain in order to address those very real, and they're not going away anytime soon, challenges, is create more flexibility in your supply chain. You need to be able to adapt. You need to be resilient. And that's employing a bunch of different tools. But I think the best tool that you can have is a strong relationship with your supply chain leaders in your organization. In particular, if you have them, 3PL relationships outside of the organization. Bring them into your discussions, have them part of the very real forecasting that occurs, how your procurement department operates and where they buy from and where they anticipate to buy from. As people are going away from China, they're looking at other markets. They're looking at different areas of pulling product that wouldn't be traditional. And so having your 3PL close to you is a key part of how you become more resilient and how you anticipate and adapt to the changes that we're only going to have. It's just going to be changes going forward. So at least we're predicting for the next 18 to 24 months, that's the ideal kind of opportunity where you're trying to minimize your disruptions within your own supply chain. And then we're seeing hopefully some changes in the future that will actually drive a little bit more predictability.
I think you have to have a symbiotic relationship with your 3PL in these kinds of times. So selecting them and doing your due diligence about the best ones out there is really critically important. Now, Steven, you talked about your job is to fill buildings. We're having a lot of conversations about inventory right now. How full are your buildings and where are they? Because I think it's really important to understand that Farrow has a really broad network as it relates to warehousing. So let's explore that landscape and see where you're located.
Sure. I'll talk about the current level of capacity right now. I think any 3PL will tell you that there's room in their buildings because there are 3PLs that will always be interested in upgrading certain business. They have business in there that may have been trading at levels that may not be ideal for the current market rates. And there will be other business that would migrate into those buildings at market rates that allow the organization to be stronger and more resilient to change. So we have 5 locations, 2 of which happens to be in the U.S. and 3 in Canada. We are national on a level in that sense that we operate in Richmond, BC, where I just came back from, and we have our Mississauga location in the GTA to cover off the major markets, and that represents kind of like our flagship operation. It's 200,000 square feet in it. And it has a very sophisticated e-com capability as well as a retail-centric fulfillment model associated with it. The other 2 are in LaSalle, Windsor, and Plymouth, Michigan, down in the States are one of our 2. And they operate almost like siblings where a lot of the inbound movement of freight that would be destined for Canada as it relates to specific orders of US-based DCs will consolidate their orders in Plymouth and we'll bring them across as a single entry. And then in Canada, we blow them out. The idea is to avoid those international freight rates. But if you can do a domestic move into Plymouth and then one cross-border into Canada and land in LaSalle, then you can go domestic rates from there. And you really leverage a ton of savings as a result of really taking a more strategic look on how your products flow and not dealing with 3,000 customs entries as products try and navigate the border. And they work both ways. We have U.S. based and Canadian based DCs that are seeking each other's market, and we enable that through the use of these various techniques to zone skip, as they call.
When you're talking about this, I've got in my mind kind of the traditional model, the brick and mortar retailers and established retail brands that are doing this. But shifting for a minute, there are also virtual stores now that are, popped up. There's brands that are, really leveraging social media to reach consumers. There's smaller brands. The whole landscape has changed somewhat. So just wondering from your perspective, how does that work for these type of companies? What are some things that they need to know?
Right, and that's an excellent point, Thomas, because the reality is the differentiators on the e-com, on the digitization side of transactional sales, are becoming less and less. You can't often decide and determine when you're online and adding to cart that this is a particularly big bricks and mortar or this is a small e-com outlet. They both can function almost identical to one another, and it's a difficult way to differentiate, but that's good from a consumer perspective, and it's good for the small business looking to make a foray. They don't even have to touch their product. It comes in and it can go out, and it doesn't have to end up in any kind of a retail environment, so you're saving on that. Where that is a challenge is you get a lot of entrants to the markets that's going to nip at the heels of the big retailers that are shifting into it, trying to define an e-com transactional consumer base. But that consumer base now is so influenced by social media and a ton of the influencers out there that can actually drive brand equity. And so you've got a ton of entrants, and that helps. We like competition. The industry should like competition. It drives a lot of innovation, and it drives development of better solutions and more customer-centric solutions, which everyone wins through. So we focus on, in our line of business, aligning ourselves with any mid-level player, any entrance to the market or mid-level player looking to grow can join a 3PL and appear very big, very sophisticated, and able to scale their business in ways that retailers would have been working really, really hard to do as they shifted into e-com. So it's a very level playing field. The mouse has created a very level playing field, which I think generally is good all around.
Yeah, level playing fields are always good for the most part. Let's talk rates and costs, Steven, because there's been a lot of talk about, particularly in the States, and I assume as well as in Canada, about just exorbitant rates for warehousing because of the amount of products come in. I love that notion of the supply chain versus the bungee. It has felt like a bungee a lot lately because of the reverberation of just cost through it and the movement of goods, and then this just pendulum swinging back and forth. And so when you look at the rates we've seen in Southern California, we've seen in Miami, we've seen in some of these ports of entry, just exorbitant warehousing rates. And then I think as a strategy, and we've been coaching our members of how to diversify away from those markets, right? And to move product to other warehousing markets that have more competitive rates. What are the rates looking like these days? And over those next 18 months, as you mentioned, how do you think the rates will be? And how much of that is kind of labor costs that are baked into it?
Yeah, excellent point, Matt. In fact, the two biggest ingredients to any 3PL, any warehousing operation, is building and labor. You will, if you don't own your building, you're leasing your building, and most 3PLs are leasing their buildings. They're dealing with a landlord that's doing exactly what we would do. They're looking for market rates, and they're looking to try and capitalize on supply and demand. All warehousing is a function of that. If there is a huge amount of supply, of course, you're going to be able to negotiate better rates when you renew your lease. In certain markets, exactly to your point, Matt, there is a higher capacity. In other markets, there's much less. But you often don't, particularly when you're dealing with Canada, when 90% of our population is within 25 miles of a border, and it's as wide as it is, you don't have the luxury of being able to go too far out of major markets in order to try and define a better cost ratio. But we are seeing that happen. We're seeing warehouses open up in Belleville and in Kingston and Cornwall, where Walmart and Amazon and large retailers, big box retailers, are finding themselves. So they're finding value in that because they're going direct and opening up their own facilities. Other 3PLs are still seeing relevance in the GTA. We're seeing rates that are sometimes 100% more than your rates would have been when you renew your lease. And that's got to cascade down to the bottom line one way or another. And what we're expecting to happen, if you haven't had to make the decision, is that's not going to change anytime soon. The vacancy rates in Toronto are less than 1%. They need to be somewhere in the neighborhood of between 7 and 8% in order for us to see a softening of the lease rates. So that's referencing the GTA area. It is a function of your vacancy levels and where the building is happening and what the land zoning requirements are. So we are all absorbing those kind of price increases. We see that effect on the bottom line. We see that when we go shopping for some of our even more basic necessities, that those costs are going up because there is a scarcity of space. And with that, you're going to have a inflationary impact on your cost of your building, which represents 50% of your costs. Labor is another function. As e-com has exploded, those buildings that require a lot of labor in order to fulfill those kind of orders are really pulling labor into them, and they're having to pay market rates for that, and means that some of the other guys have to make adjustments and pivot. It's a challenge. It is a challenge that we all face. I don't think 3PLs are immune, and certainly not retailers aren't immune. They're all trying to deal with a shifting labor market in and out of industries, and just trying to adapt to it.
All right. So let's say you're hearing this right now and you're hearing all these challenges, potential disruptions. You're thinking about inflation. You're thinking about recession, the economy, and you say to yourself, I need to make some dramatic changes with supply chains. I know you've said that may not be the best idea to make dramatic changes over in the near future. Why is that? Can you talk about why you might want to think twice about dramatic changes?
Our view on that is because dramatic changes you can't control some of them, but you can control others. And that's the decision around, we are dealing with enough external influences, enough external, challenges, be it off country or off of the continent and in overseas, origin stations. Those are the challenges you're dealing with. The challenges of getting equipment locally. There's a shift towards terminating containers at port, which we've never really had to deal with before. North America was the only continent that ever did inland bridges for their containerized freight. So now people are having to add a line item to the supply chain that says, well, I'm actually having to transload my inventory at port and bring it in through other means. Those kind of challenges you can't avoid, but you can avoid the decision that you're going to uproot your entire supply chain and move it into another relationship that has its own challenges as it relates to integration. You have to make sure that the EDI connections are right. You have to make sure that the relationships, the alignment are right. People that we're talking to right now at Farrow are organizations that are recognizing that their current 3PL are not part of their future. They're not challenging them as much as they ought to. They're not pushing their business forward. They're not looking for ways of improvement. They're not adapting. And so we're talking to mostly the organizations that are faced with that very real decision of having to change it in order to deal with future disruptions. And that's the challenges that most people are facing, is like, do I make the change now? And those that do, it's almost like house buying. If people are buying a house in a low market, it's because they have to. And when you have to, and you have to make that decision, then you want to pick a vendor that's going to give you the resilience going forward. You want to really identify somebody who has the proper investment in their technology, who is located properly, who has the adaptability and the solutions, like they have a suite of solutions they can employ, and allows you to weather future storms.
Adaptability. I think that that brings up a point too that I was thinking about is, we're listening to this, everybody that's listening to it, there's a virtual or digital connection. You're listening to us through the podcast. We have weekly calls where we're digitized there, and every industry, every sector is looking at digitization. And I'm just wondering how that plays into supply chains. Our dependence on being digitized, are there good things about that? Are there bad things about that? And what do you need to know about how to navigate digitization with supply chains?
Yeah, no, it's a very real benefit to the evolution of our dependence on technology. Digitization affects every aspect of the supply chain. There's not a single part of it. We've always been fairly technology has always been a part of supply chain. It had to have been for us to deal with global and economies and movement of freight. But where it's become a lot more relevant lately is on the forecasting, is on the predictability modeling, is creating these twins to your supply chain, so you can move things around within your supply chain based on certain scenarios and actually understand how that impacts your bottom line, how that impacts your speed to market, how that impacts your ability to deal with an increase in your reverse logistics, like how many returns you get, what effect that's going to have on your cost of money, because it's all tied up in the product that's coming back in. Digitization allows us to create the proper scenarios and the proper solutions to those scenarios to impact how the bottom line is impacted by change. It also is a way for younger employees to get into the marketplace, because these are postgraduates. You've gone to school, you've got a certain level of a skill set that some of the old dinosaurs that have always tended to stick around in supply chain may not be as skilled at managing or understanding. They understand the general trends, but really the embracing of technology and how the different applications can show your supply chain in a very real way is a key aspect towards the change that's going on within the supply chain itself. It's getting younger, it's getting more dynamic, it's getting much more of an open embracing of the different tools associated with identifying a healthy supply chain versus one that isn't as resilient.
You know, Steven, I really like the point you just made about kind of as a 3PL guiding companies through these difficult decisions. You don't want a 3PL that's passive. You want a 3PL with critical thought, that symbiotic relationship. It's kind of like going to a fine restaurant you've never been to. And does the waiter have a point of view, or are they just going to throw the menu in front of you and tell you to pick what you want? And I think that it sounds like you all really bring that to the table. And so as we close out this conversation, one, I want to thank you for your insights, but two, what's the best way for folks to get in touch with you or with Farrow on the logistics side so that people can connect and learn more about what you guys do?
Sure. Through our website, you can create a lead generator that would, from a warehousing perspective, would be routed to myself, or my email is just my first and last name, Steven.Crerar, Crerar, at farrowlogistics.com, and punch me a note directly. You know, the idea is that we want to engage our particular prospects in conversations around what their vision is. What are they challenged? What are their previous history? What is it that they think that they're going to face? And then we bring into that conversation our cumulative knowledge of our existing customer base and what we have done to help them in various challenges that they faced. There's a myriad of different ways that supply chains can be tweaked in order to meet a very real necessity and very real issue that they have. And that's not going to happen without, that transparent conversation, that open and clear conversation around what it means and how you're going to be able to meet your future challenges. So Farrow, we focus a lot on that. We know that happens on the brokerage side. We know that happens also on the freight side. And we know that happens on the warehousing side. And we have all of the pieces that can weave that solution into a seamless execution.
That's awesome. That's awesome. You know, Tom, as I think about this, as we started this conversation, Steven was relaying the fact that and you did too, that everyone and their brother kind of knows about the supply chain at this point. I kind of like it to the grandma standard. If your grandma is talking to you about it, or depending on how old you are, both of mine have passed, may they rest in peace. If your mother's talking to you about it, then it's reached like public consciousness. And so, Steven, thank you for coming on the program to help us talk more critically about what's out there and what our members need to do to just navigate these choppy waters, because they don't seem the chop continues and it's one thing after the next. And so critical partnerships is really important. So thanks for coming on.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, folks, this has been another exciting edition of Shoe and Show. I really do encourage you to go back and listen to our conversation with Mary McNally of Crocs in January. I think it was one of the first episodes of the year. You can go to shoeandshow.com and then come back and listen to this one. These are really good bookends to the supply chain conversation. Mary on the logistics side from Asia, and then Steven here in the States and in Canada about on the warehousing side. I think you'd find a lot of great value in kind of listening to those side by side. In the meantime, share the program with your friends. We were just talking in our little digital green room, speaking of digital, about we're approaching 7 years of this program, which blows my mind. And so we are so grateful for your listenership and for you joining us week after week and sending us information and asking us questions and asking us to cover certain topics. It means the world to us. So spread the word, share it with friends and family. Hit us up on shoeandshow.com for all the episodes that you want, and make sure you subscribe. And again, thanks for joining us. Until next time, Shoe and Show is out.
Shoe In has been brought to you by the FDRA, the Footwear Industries Association focused on retail, trade, politics, and fashion, helping create and enhance conversations on all things footwear. For information about FDRA, visit fdra.org.